Hello again, I'm Braddock Supervisor John Cook. Welcome back to Braddock Neighborhood News, the program I am using to provide you with information on issues facing our community and ideas on how we can strengthen our neighborhoods. This month, I'm honored to have State Senator Chap Petersen and Delegate David Bulova on the show. These two men hold important elected positions in Virginia, and every year, beginning the second week in January, they convene in Richmond for the annual session of the General Assembly. As is the case each year, members of the House and Senate meet to ensure that the needs of the citizens of the Commonwealth are addressed. Chap, David, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, John.
It's great having you. Let's talk a little bit about what the General Assembly is. You know, those of us in government know, but some of our viewers might not. Chap, the State Senate, the senior House, it's got its own personality.
It does. The State Senate's a little bit older, literally, in terms of the age of the membership. Most of the members have been in the legislature for a while. I think I've been in the legislature for going on 12 years now since I was first elected, and that's actually on the junior side. So it's a little bit older, a little bit more experienced, perhaps a little bit more boring, I think my colleagues would say, but I love to be there, and it's got its own culture.
David, the House, a little bigger and a little, some would say more rambunctious maybe?
Bigger, more boisterous, more connected to the people, as I like to say. We got 100 members of the House of Delegates. I've been in there, this will be my 8th session, so I was first elected in 2005, but we run every 2 years rather than every 4 years, and so we're actually co-equal. There's no power that we have that the Senate doesn't have, and vice versa, but because we do get elected every 2 years, it tends to be kind of the idea generation machine, and a little bit more arguing, a little bit more animated, but together I think the Senate and the House of Delegates together do a pretty good job for Virginia.
And that's one of the things that for people to understand, that for a bill to pass and become law, it's got to go through both houses, then go through the governor, and so you can introduce a bill in your own house, you can even pass in your own house, but it means nothing if the other house, you got to have somebody in the other house to push it.
Generally, you need to have 6 successful votes before a bill passes. You need to get it through the subcommittee of the original House, then the full committee of the same House, then you need to get a floor vote. So if you do that and you get it through the Senate, you get through the subcommittee, the committee, then the floor vote. Then you'll go to the House side, you do the process all over again, subcommittee, committee, floor vote. So typically you need 6 votes before you get to the governor's desk. And you can get killed on any one of those levels.
Right. Now, how much do members of the different houses work together? Like, do you guys work together on a lot of bills? Do you find that that's the way to do it, or do you push the bill through your own house and hope somebody else picks it up, David?
Well, it depends on the issue, really. Chap and I work very, very closely together. You know, typically by tradition, if I'm carrying something in the House, if it makes it through and gets over to the Senate, Chap is the person who is going to defend that over on the Senate side. You know, it's kind of an odd tradition, you know, with the House and the Senate. You think about partisan politics, but really you're not even supposed to refer to the other body by name when you're debating on the House floor, and I imagine that's the same way on the Senate floor. But you know, ultimately they got to work well together. That happens in conference committee, and so if a bill is passed in one form over in the House and amended over into the Senate, oftentimes, if there's a disagreement on the finer points, then it goes to a conference committee that's made up of House and Senate members, and that's where things are really hashed out on individual bills. And I think most importantly, that's how the budget process goes forward.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's a big part of the year every year is the budget, whether it's a main budget year or an amendment year.
Yeah, I mean, this year, for example, it's an amendment year. Last year was our biennium budget. But even so, we've got about $400 million in surplus that we have to allocate. And then inevitably, every governor will make amendments to the budget and will want to change to, you know, fit priorities and to sort of maybe accelerate spending or cut back spending in different areas. So even in an off year like this, we'll still have a budget that we have to approve.
And you know, there's a regional dynamic in Richmond as well. And you know, we talk about partisan politics, Republican, Democrat. But for Northern Virginia, many times Republicans and Democrats up here agree on something and maybe disagree with their own party in other parts of the state. How much do you see that?
Well, I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, even before you had political parties, you had regions, you had counties, and so you've always had an aspect of the legislature dating back to the 17th century where people represent their community. And our community is our community is Central Fairfax. It's a suburban district with some urban characteristics, relatively affluent compared to the rest of the state, but we're having a lot of issues, particularly in terms of people with English as a second language, traffic needs, things like that. And then you'll have other parts of the state where people don't have jobs, and so it's a whole different dynamic. And I mean, that's part of what we do, is try and fit those interests together and come up with some type of synthesis.
Yeah. It happens a lot in the House.
Yeah, I mean the House in particular, because our districts tend to be either urban or rural.
Yeah.
And so there's fewer people that have districts that kind of include both, and so people tend to line up a little bit more. I think transportation is a great example. You know, as Chap mentioned, in some parts of the state, that's not their big issue.
Right.
It is going to be jobs, and up here, of course, fixing our transportation issues really does equate to jobs. We rely on getting around in order to make sure our economy continues to move forward.
And it's a different sort of focus. For example, in Northern Virginia, we need transportation, we need roads so we can get to work. In, for example, Southwest Virginia, they need to build a Coalfields Expressway to connect counties so they can bring in jobs, because there are no jobs. So they're trying to actually create jobs that don't already exist. We're trying to connect people to jobs that do exist, and we need to get them there.
Yeah, I think another one, you know, for instance, that is going to be a hot button issue for Northern Virginia this year is cost to compete funding for public education. And,
Right.
you know, Northern Virginia gets additional money because it is so much more expensive to live here and to hire here, and that's something that other parts of the state see as kind of gratuitous. Why should Northern Virginia get that? And the governor's introduced budget this time around, he's actually trying to take away some of that cost to compete funding, and that's something that last year when that was attempted, we were able to converge as a caucus and try to get as much of that back as possible.
And let me bring up another issue, and you can appreciate as a lawyer, John, judges. Circuit Court judges in Fairfax County, we've just lost one. We're going to lose another one. We'll be down from 15 to 13 judges in Fairfax County Circuit Court, and that's based upon a metric in which we have a, quote, lighter caseload. But our cases tend to be more complicated. Our civil cases tend to be more complex. There's more money involved. And secondly, the way we charge criminal counts, we tend to charge all the counts under one case as opposed to separate cases. So that's another formula where we've been shortchanged. And again, it has to do with, you know, regional issues and regional priorities.
You know, you've both talked about formulas, and that's so important. You know, it's everything when you're doing legislation, and the average person might not sort of realize that. Somebody says, well, let's get more money for education. But the real issue is, or can be, how do you allocate what's there?
Right.
And just because there's more money in the pot doesn't mean our schools get any more.
And what I've told people is, and I've said this many, many times, under the basic aid formula, Fairfax County is a 0.69 LCI, somewhere around there, which means essentially that we get a fraction of what we send down to Richmond under the formula, and that's based on wealth. And my point is that there are other formulas in which we do better. For example, law enforcement, 599 money, what we call 599, which is law enforcement money. So oftentimes, the dollar in the state budget, if it's allocated, let's say, to law enforcement, will give a better return to Fairfax County than if it's allocated to K through 12 education. Right. So people that say, "Oh, fully fund the standards of quality," I said, well, if you do that, you're basically transferring wealth out of Fairfax County to the rest of the state.
Well, and you know, oftentimes it depends on who originally wrote that formula, as far as whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for Northern Virginia. And, you know, again, for the education formula, it's a measure of wealth and revenue generating capacity. The guy who actually wrote that was from the Hampton Roads area, and so what was not included in there was the power to tax hotels and motels, and of course that area brings in a lot of money under those, and yet they're not included with respect to a county or a locality's ability to bring in revenue, and so it favors those localities and hurts Northern Virginia. I think everybody realizes that it's not a perfect system, and there is always a lot of commitment to rewrite it, but it creates winners and losers. And so actually sitting down and doing the math and trying to come up with something fair is easier said than done.
You know, and that's right. And of course, we have a lot of interaction between locality and the state and our boards talking about issues. And yeah, I mean, it's easy to say more education and more transportation. It's also almost meaningless. It doesn't. Everybody agrees, but the devil's in the details.
Right.
And those details, you know, can get down to some one little line, one little sentence written somewhere, but it does make all that difference.
Right.
You know, one thing I'd ask you about, one of the things that the three of us all share is that we're all in the minority party on our respective boards.
Right.
That has its own dynamic.
Well, we're actually 50-50 in the Senate.
You're right,
but
and
de
that's right.
facto minority.
De facto because of the lieutenant governor. That changes a little bit the dynamic about how you can get your own personal agenda across, and I think every elected body is different. Chap, the Senate's, I think, a little different from the House. And
yeah, well, in the Senate, we're allowed to vote proxies because since there are fewer members, but we have all the same number of committees, it's harder for people to be in two places at once, so we're allowed to vote a proxy. And how that worked was when we were in the majority, the Democrats that is, I sat on the Courts of Justice Committee and I sat on the Civil Justice Subcommittee, and I would typically hold 3 or 4 proxies for fellow members. And that gave me a tremendous amount of power because literally I was in a position to vote the Democratic vote, which was the majority vote. And you know, that type of power it's great. I mean, that we're in government to do things for people. It's also very challenging because you got to be very careful what you're doing. You know, one thing about being in a minority, and I've been in the minority, John, I'm not picking on you. You can object a lot, and you can make a fuss, and you don't have the responsibility oftentimes to be the decision maker.
it's a different role sometimes.
It's a different role. It is.
Yeah. And
well,
David, you guys really see it in the House.
Yeah. On the House side, it's more lopsided than the Senate, let's put it that way. But you can still get a lot done, and what you got to do is approach it incrementally. And I'm always amazed when you take a look at the federal level or even other states. If you're in the minority party, you're likely not to get anything through. Where if you work hard in the House, you can still get a number of bills passed. There's still kind of that Virginia gentility that looks at the issues, and you might not be able to get something really big passed. Because often if it's a good idea, somebody else will take it.
Right.
And that's fine. I don't need to take credit for it. But you are able to get things through. The other thing, kind of mirroring what Chap is saying, they've got committees. You usually don't break out into subcommittees. In the House, though, we put a lot of power on the subcommittee level. And subcommittees in the House can be anywhere from 5 to 9 people. And so, again, you might be in the minority party, but when you are one of 5 people looking at a bill, and in the House, typically bills can live or die in subcommittee. They don't have to go to a committee or any place else. That is a lot of power. And if you're smart, you do your homework, you make a good case, you could sometimes stop a good or bad bill or get a good bill through.
That's a good point on if you're the ranking minority member or you're the chair of a committee or a subcommittee, you can really get some big stuff done.
When I was a freshman in the House back in 2002, I carried the bill to legalize soju in Virginia. Soju is basically Korean vodka, and it was illegal to serve shot glasses or by the drink. You couldn't serve it except under very restricted circumstances. I carried that bill. 95% of the people had no idea what I was talking about. The bill passed, and it became one of the most significant impacts on Korean restaurants, which are, of course, everywhere in Northern Virginia.
Right.
And, it's funny, I was 33 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. It was a constituent request. We got it passed. So sometimes, honestly, you don't know it's going to be significant until you look back 10 years later and say, wow, that really made a difference.
And, we all learn that getting something done isn't just, boy, I've got the greatest idea in the world and nobody else ever thought of this, so I'm going to speak it and it's going to happen. It's sitting down with people and talking and figuring stuff out, and they can be people in your party and the other party across regional lines. And in fact, that's really where it gets done.
You got to do your homework. And the fun thing about the General Assembly is actually getting constituents and people involved. Sure. Kind of similar to Chap. It was probably about 3 years ago. I was approached by the owners of some local yoga studios, and I guess the State Council for Higher Education decided they were going to regulate their training programs in the exact same way as they would any other institution of higher education. And these are, the quintessential small businesses. And so you had these folks come in and say, well, what do we do? And it was actually great to bring them in and say, all right, if you're really serious about this issue, first we got to figure out what it is that we need to change in the code, but then you need to figure out how we're going to reach out to legislators, how we're going to create some synergy, some pressure, and ultimately we got it through. But it was primarily because we had a group of citizens who were willing to come together to do that, and they had a blast. They really did. I think most people don't realize It's challenging, but it can also be very fulfilling to come down to the General Assembly and be part of that process.
You know, and let me ask you about kind of that process, because it's very different from our board. We meet all year long and we have committee meetings, and then we wait a month before we revisit the issue on a board level, and then we talk about it some more. You guys go down there for 35, 45 days or 60 days, but then you meet every day, all day. You go from 7:30 in the morning till whenever. Talk about kind of your typical day in Richmond, and then about just the speed, the pace, the numbers of decisions you're making in a day, because it's a lot.
Well, this is how I typically handle it. I try and get up about 5:30. I try and exercise every morning. I go to the YMCA on Franklin Street, either go for a run or lift weights, but try and do something to get my body stimulated. Get back, take a shower, and I'm usually at my office by 7:30. If I have an early morning subcommittee, I'll usually start at 7:30. Then we'll have regular committees, typically start at 9 or 10. And then we'll have that will be all morning. And then Democratic caucus at 11:30. We meet as a caucus. We'll walk through the legislation. We'll kind of whip the votes or talk about where people stand. And then we go into session at noon. The session can be either a few minutes, or when we get towards crossover, it can be hours, several hours. And then we get out. Typically we have committee meetings in the afternoon. And then probably around 5 o'clock, you're finally got some free time. And either you're meeting with constituents, meeting with lobbyists, going to receptions, and then I typically get back to my office around 7, and I got to do some legal work because I got to make money for myself, and also sort of check emails, return phone calls. I probably get back to my place in Richmond, I'm going to say around 9. And you know, if the Capitals are on TV or something like that, I might watch a little bit of the game and then I go to sleep.
Yeah.
Does that correspond to the House side, David?
Similar, minus the I'm not quite so good at the getting up at 5 o'clock to exercise, but I enjoy those extra hour and a half of sleep. But you know, like you hit on, it is a part-time legislature. So you know, this year we'll be meeting 45 days. On a long year, it's 60 days. But you know, what I think folks don't necessarily realize is how busy those 45 or 60 days are. On a typical year, you've got about 2,000 bills that are going to be introduced, and not all of them are going to make it up to the House floor or the Senate floor, but most of them, by and large, are going to vote someplace. And so trying to debate and vote on that much stuff within a short period of time makes it a very fast-paced process. And so, you know, like Chap, you know, I wake up, usually get in the office around 7, subcommittee meetings in the morning, committee meetings, House floor at noon, and then you kind of do it all over again, where you've got committees and subcommittees that go till about 5 or 6, and then you kind of move on. And in between there, you know, usually the highlights of the day are when you have constituents who will come down and lobby on different issues or just want to kind of chat.
Right.
But that's the part that you really like. It keeps you grounded back to the people at home.
The irony is, John, you might think it's exhausting being in all these committee meetings, but in a way it's a type of refuge, because if you're back in your office, there's a line of people that want to advocate and lobby and talk to you, and that's great. I mean, that's what we're in politics for. But sometimes it can, if you do it all day, it can be exhausting. So, you know, it's good to be in committee where you can just focus on one speaker at a time.
Right. So how many votes do you take in a given day?
I'm going to say in a committee meeting, probably 30. In a subcommittee, maybe 15 to 20. Committee meeting, maybe 30 to 40. And then on the floor, could be up to 200 or as few as, say, 20. And a lot of them are uncontested. So, you know, maybe only a third of those are contested. Maybe a third to a half of those are contested. And in the Senate, and this is a problem, lots of times bills are contested, but people don't debate them. And that's a function of, you know, people either know where they stand and they're just not as anxious to speak, or people just don't like to speak against each other's bills, which I've never understood, because quite frankly, I take nothing personal if people, you know, bash some of my legislation. But there's less public speaking in the Senate, more in the House.
Why do you think that is, David?
I think it's kind of a cultural thing over in the House, where there's, you know, an expectation that you're going to duke it out, and we do try to keep it not personal, and that's one of the things that you really do kind of cherish, is that you can go head to head on the House floor and then go up afterwards and say, hey, that was a good debate.
Oh yeah, No, I'm a big believer in that. And for example, Mark Obenshane is sort of my counterpart. He's a trial attorney on the Republican side, and we go at it. And I'll even say, listen, I'm coming after you on this one, and I'll put him on like I'm cross-examining a witness, and I'll question, his not his personal motivations, but his political motivations. And to me, part of politics is entertainment, and I want people to sort of be interested in what's going on, and I want to sort of draw out some of the distinctions and the social implications or moral implications of an issue. I remember years ago, this is on the House side, there was a question about Medicaid and what was exempt and what was not exempt, and how a person's jewelry could be used to like take them off of Medicaid. And I had the sponsor stand up and ask him, I said, so you're going to tell me my grandmother, who's 86 years old, would have to sell her wedding ring in order to qualify for Medicaid? And he's like, hum, ha. And I'm like, bang. And that was, sure enough, they had to withdraw the bill and fix that. So it's just like trying a case, John. I mean, that's your moment.
Right. It is very fast, though, and it's the same thing over in the Senate, where if you look at CNN or any of the votes up in Congress, they'll open up the roll and slowly but surely
send
comes
down
through.
Their page or someone to cast a vote.
In the House and the Senate, literally after the debate has happened, the Speaker will say, shall the bill pass?
Right.
And you've got less than 5 seconds to decide whether you're going to vote yes or no. There's no, can I have a few minutes to think about it?
Right.
So you need to do your homework going into session, because especially when you get halfway through, where you are literally going to be voting on hundreds of bills in a day, if you haven't figured out how you're going to vote on that, or at least think about the pros and cons about what might tip your vote during the debate, you can get behind very quick.
Yeah, you can.
How much does the party structure play in some of those votes? I mean, we look at Congress, about the whips, and they go around, they're twisting elbows, but it's a little different in Richmond.
Yeah, I'd like to say party plays no role, but that would be ridiculous and nobody would believe me. There's a lot of votes that break down on party lines. Each party has institutional players. For example, on the Democratic side, AFL-CIO, organized labor is someone that members of our caucus feel a strong affinity to. There's other, environmental issues, for example, that we're going to want to, if where possible, try and be consistent with principles that we've, campaigned on. In terms of the party structure, probably where it has the most impact is when we form committees. And of course, we had this happen last year, that the majority party controls the committees. They control the committee chairmanships, who decide what bills get heard and when they get heard. And they control who sits on the committee, which is going to decide what bills pass and which don't. And so, when we organize and place people on committees, that's all based on party.
And how's that play? The Senate almost, I guess 2020
we're 2020,
right now,
we're even.
But one way or the other. The House has been very lopsided for a number of years. How's that party dynamic play in the House?
It certainly plays out, and it's always fascinating when it's a mix of the party politics versus the regional politics, because oftentimes you'll hold a big part of your caucus together, but for whatever reasons you need to split off. And so I know at least on the Democratic side, as Chap said, that there's issues where you try to gel around, but we all also realize that you have to be accountable to the people back at home, and so you vote your conscience, vote your district, and take it from there. So
yeah, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, you got to be loyal to yourself, and I mean, take the most controversial position out there, abortion. Well, we have 2 members of our caucus that are pro-life, and they vote that way every time, and so we know that, and that's something that we have to factor into the caucus. And for example, when we were in the majority, you could sort of guard against that by not putting them on certain committees. When you're 2020, you don't have that option. So,
you go down to Richmond. We've just talked a lot about the very fast pace. You're passing all these bills, but you're not done being the senator or the delegate when you come home. There's a lot of work you do all year long. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, you know what? I actually, as you know, John, when I'm back home, I've got to practice law and make money. So my senatorial duties to some extent fit around that. And what I try and do is I try and set aside a certain amount of time every day, every weekend to be a senator, to be an elected politician. And typically, weekday mornings at 8 a.m., I meet constituents at Main Street Bagel. It's in the middle of Fairfax City. I know David meets people there too. And that's sort of my constituent meeting time. In the afternoon, particularly if it's nice weather, I'm in an election cycle, I'm going to be out hitting doors. I'll be at events typically in the evening. But I try and be disciplined. Sometimes I have to be disciplined to say I can't be at every event because I've got to make a living. I've got my own business. I got to support my family. And so, yes, it is full-time outside of session, but by the same token, I do have to subordinate it to being a dad.
We got about 30 seconds left. David, from your perspective, what are you doing when you're not in Richmond?
Well,
as a delegate?
you balance your legislative duties and work, and then obviously family. And so, my job off session is to listen. We also have commissions that meet off session, and so Joint Healthcare Commission, State Water Commission, and Housing Commission are things that I sit on that meet all year round as we try to figure out what kind of legislation might be introduced during the next session.
Great. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Senator Petersen and Delegate Bulova for taking time out of their busy schedules to join me today. Their insights into the workings of the General Assembly help us to understand better our state government in Richmond. I hope you've enjoyed this segment of Braddock Neighborhood News. Thank you for watching. If you have a question or concern, please contact my office by email at braddock@fairfaxcounty.gov or call 703-425-9300. Tune in next month for another edition, and please remember to look for ways to volunteer. Your community needs you.